A millionaire's daughter forced to marry a humble gardener. But what she did next left everyone stunned. "I'm saying that you're getting married, Emily. And before you ask, no, you don't have a choice in the matter." Richard Collins' cold ultimatum to his rebellious daughter set in motion a tale of unexpected love, personal growth, and a fight to save a community's legacy. But as Emily stood facing her father, her voice trembling with newfound strength, she uttered words that would change everything. "And maybe it's time to take a risk for something that matters. Dad, when you forced me to marry Jake, you said it was to teach me responsibility. Well, this is me taking responsibility, not just for myself, but for our family legacy, for this entire community." Little did Emily know, her forced marriage would lead her to discover a love deeper than she ever imagined and a purpose greater than she ever dreamed. Watch now to see how a spoiled heiress and a mysterious gardener turned an arranged marriage into a powerful alliance that would shake the very foundations of their world. Richard Collins sat in his expansive office, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the polished mahogany desk. His gaze wandered over the sprawling Napa Valley vineyard that stretched out before him, row upon row of meticulously tended grapevines disappearing into the horizon. It was a view that usually filled him with pride, a tangible representation of his success and power. But today, his thoughts were far from serene. His daughter Emily had crossed the line again. The report from his private investigator lay open on his desk, detailing her latest act of rebellion. Emily was dating some ne'er-do-well, a troublemaker from Los Angeles with a penchant for fast cars and faster living. Richard's jaw clenched as he thought about it. He had given her everything: wealth, education, opportunities, and this was how she repaid him. Richard Collins was a man accustomed to control. He had built his empire from the ground up, transforming a small family vineyard into a multi-million-dollar wine business through sheer determination and iron will. He applied that same level of control to every aspect of his life, including his daughters, especially after her mother passed away. Emily had always been headstrong, pushing against every boundary he set. But lately, her rebellion had reached new heights. Richard refused to let her throw her future away on some foolish romance with a man who had no prospects. He needed to teach her a lesson, one she wouldn't forget. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, painting the vineyard in hues of gold and crimson, Richard's thoughts darkened. He formulated a plan, one so severe it would force Emily to reconsider her choices. His eyes fell on the figure of Jake, the estate's gardener, visible through the window as he worked among the rosebushes. Jake had been a fixture on the Collins estate for years, tending to the vineyards and gardens with quiet diligence. He was a simple man, someone who never asked for more than his modest wages and the satisfaction of a job well done. Richard had always appreciated Jake's work ethic, his reliability. Now, he saw Jake in a new light, as the perfect pawn in his game to control Emily. Richard picked up the phone, his decision made. "Jake," he said when the call connected, "I need to see you in my office. Now." "Ow." A few minutes later, there was a soft knock at the door. Jake entered, removing his worn cap, as he always did out of respect. He was in his early 30s, with rugged good looks honed by years of outdoor work. His demeanor radiated calm, a stark contrast to Emily's fiery temperament. "You wanted to see me, Mr. Collins?" Jake asked, his tone polite but wary. Richard leaned back in his leather chair, studying Jake with narrowed eyes. "Yes, Jake, I have a proposition for you. It involves my daughter, Emily." Jake frowned, clearly confused. He knew Emily, of course. Everyone on the estate did. She was beautiful, intelligent, and willful, the kind of woman who didn't hesitate to make her displeasure known. And she had made it abundantly clear that she considered herself above the likes of Jake and the other staff. "Sir?" Jake prompted when Richard remained silent. Richard stood, moving to the window to look out over his domain. "I'm sure you've noticed Emily's behavior lately," he began, his voice cold and calculating. "She's been reckless, irresponsible, making decisions that could ruin her future. I can't allow that to continue." Jake remained silent, though his frown deepened. He had indeed noticed Emily's increasingly wild behavior, her late-night parties, and her parade of questionable boyfriends. But it wasn't his place to comment on the boss's daughter. Richard turned back to face Jake, his expression unreadable. "I want her to learn responsibility, Jake. I want her to understand that life isn't all about indulgence and defiance." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room. "So, I've decided that she will marry you." The room seemed to still, and for a moment, Jake looked like he hadn't heard correctly. "Marry me?" he repeated, incredulity clear in his voice. "Yes," Richard confirmed, his tone brooking no argument. "You're a good man, Jake. Hardworking, dependable. You represent everything Emily needs to learn. She'll see firsthand what life is like for people who aren't handed everything on a silver platter." Jake stared at Richard, his expression unreadable. "But sir, I'm just a gardener," he protested weak-lusted. Millie, she doesn't even like me. This doesn't seem right." Richard waved a hand dismissively. "It's not about like Jake. It's about discipline. You'll be doing her a favor in the long run. She needs to grow up, and you'll help her do that." He paused, his voice softening slightly. "And you'll be compensated handsomely, of course." Silence stretched between them, the weight of Richard's words hanging in the air. Jake shifted uncomfortably, glancing out the window as if the vineyards might offer some escape from the situation he was now a part of. "I don't know, Mr. Collins," Jake began, but Richard cut him off. "You don't have a choice," Richard said firmly. "Neither of you do." Jake lowered his gaze, understanding that there was no point in arguing. When Richard Collins made a decision, there was no reversing it. The fate of both Jake and Emily had been sealed in this moment, their lives irrevocably changed by the whim of a powerful man. As Jake left the office, his mind reeling from the unexpected turn of events, Richard turned back to the window. The sun had set now, leaving the vineyard in deepening twilight. He told himself that he was doing this for Emily's own good, that she would thank him one day for showing her the value of hard work and simplicity. But deep down, in a part of himself he rarely acknowledged, Richard knew that this was about control. It was about bending Emily to his will, about shaping her life to fit his vision. And if Jake was caught in the crossfire, well, that was simply collateral damage. As darkness fell over the Collins estate, Richard Collins stood alone in his office, the architect of a plan that would change lives forever. The stage was set, the players unwitting pawns in his game. All that remained was to inform Emily of her impending marriage. Richard allowed himself a small, grim smile. She wouldn't like it, of course. But then, that was rather the point. Emily Collins stepped out of her cherry-red Porsche, the car's engine still purring behind her. The valet rushed forward, eager to park the vehicle worth more than he'd make in a decade. Emily tossed him the keys without a second glance, her stilettos clicking against the pavement as she made her way to the entrance of Los Angeles' most exclusive nightclub. The bouncer recognized her immediately, unhooking the velvet rope to let her pass. "Evening, Miss Collins," he said, his voice a mix of deference and poorly concealed admiration. Emily flashed him a dazzling smile, reveling in the power she held over people with just her name and her looks. Inside, the club was a cacophony of thumping music and flashing lights. Bodies writhed on the dance floor, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and top-shelf liquor. This was Emily's world, a far cry from the stuffy confines of her father's vineyard. "Emily." A voice called out over the din. She turned to see her best friend, Sophia, waving from a VIP booth. Emily made her way over, accepting a glass of champagne from a passing waiter as she went. "You're late," Sophia pouted, but there was no real reproach in her voice. Emily being fashionably late was as much a part of their nights out as the endless flow of alcohol and the paparazzi lurking outside. Emily shrugged, sliding into the booth. "Daddy dearest decided to lecture me again about my irresponsible behavior," she said, rolling her eyes. "And as if he has any right to talk about responsibility." Sophia laughed, raising her glass in a mock toast. "To Richard Collins, the most controlling father in all of California." Emily clinked her glass against Sophia's, downing the champagne in one elegant gulp. "He threatened to cut me off again," she confided, signaling for another drink. "Said I need to start taking the family business seriously." "And?" Sophia prompted, knowing there was more to the story. A wicked grin spread across Emily's face. "And I told him he could take his precious vineyard and shove it where the sun doesn't shine." The group in the booth erupted in laughter and cheers. This was why they loved Emily, her sharp tongue, her defiance, her utter disregard for the rules that bound the rest of them. As the night wore on, Emily found herself at the center of attention, as always. She danced on tables, ordered rounds of drinks for complete strangers, and flirted shamelessly with anyone who caught her eye. It was a performance, in a way, a carefully cultivated image of the wild child heiress. But beneath the carefree exterior, there was a part of Emily that ached. A part that longed for something more, something real. She pushed that feeling down, drowning it in another shot of tequila. As Jake left the study, his mind reeling, he caught sight of Emily watching him from the top of the stairs. Their eyes met, a moment of shared disbelief and resignation passing between them. In that moment, standing on opposite ends of the grand staircase, Emily and Jake were united in their powerlessness, two pawns in a game orchestrated by Richard Collins. Neither of them could have predicted the journey that lay ahead, the challenges and revelations that would test them both in ways they could never have imagined. The stage was set, the players in place. In 2 weeks' time, a most unusual marriage would take place, one that would change the lives of everyone involved forever. The day of the wedding dawned bright and clear, the California sun casting a golden glow over the Collins estate. But inside the main house, the atmosphere was anything but cheerful. Emily stood in her childhood bedroom, staring at her reflection in the full-length mirror. The wedding dress she wore was beautiful, a creation of silk and lace that would have cost a small fortune. Yet Emily felt like she was wearing a straitjacket. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. "Come in," she called, her voice flat and emotionless. Sophia, her best friend and maid of honor, entered the room. Her eyes were red-rimmed, evidence of the tears she'd shed on Emily's behalf. "Oh, Em," she said softly, "you look beautiful." Emily turned away from the mirror, unable to bear the sight of herself any longer. "I look like a prisoner being led to the gallows." Sophia crossed the room and took Emily's hands in hers. "It's not too late, you know. We could still make a run for it. I have a car waiting. Just say the word." For a moment, Emily was tempted. The thought of fleeing, of escaping this forced marriage and her father's control, was almost overwhelming. But then reality set in. Where would she go? What would she do? Her father's influence reached far and wide. There would be no escape, not really. Emily shook her head, squeezing Sophia's hands. "I can't. You know I can't. But thank you for offering." A knock at the door signaled that it was time. Emily took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "Let's get this over with," she muttered. Meanwhile, in another part of the house, Jake was adjusting his tie for the 100th time. The suit he wore felt foreign and uncomfortable, a far cry from his usual work clothes. He still couldn't quite believe this was happening. Marriage had never been part of his plan, let alone marriage to the boss's daughter. There was a knock at the door, and Richard Collins entered. He surveyed Jake with a critical eye. "You clean up well," he said, his tone somewhere between approval and condescension. Jake remained silent, unsure of how to respond. "What do you say to the man who's forcing you to marry his daughter?" Richard seemed to sense Jake's discomfort. His expression softened slightly. "I know this isn't ideal," he said, "but I truly believe this is for the best. Emily needs someone like you in her life, someone who can teach her the value of hard work and simplicity." Jake found his voice at last. "With all due respect, Mr. Collins, I'm not sure I'm the right person for that job. Emily and I were from different worlds." Richard clapped a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Worlds can collide, Jake. Sometimes that collision creates something beautiful." With that enigmatic statement, he left the room, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts once more. The garden of the Collins estate had been transformed for the occasion. Rows of white chairs faced an elegant floral arch, under which Jake now stood, waiting for his bride. The guests, mostly business associates of Richard and their families, murmured amongst themselves. The absence of Emily's friends was noticeable, a clear sign that this was not a typical society wedding. As the string quartet began to play, all heads turned to watch Emily make her entrance. She walked down the aisle on her father's arm, her face a mask of cool indifference. Jake couldn't help but admire her beauty, even as he felt a pang of guilt for his part in this charade. When they reached the altar, Richard placed Emily's hand in Jake's. "Take care of her," he said, his voice carrying a hint of warning. The officiant began the ceremony, his words about love and commitment ringing hollow in the face of the reality of the situation. Emily and Jake exchanged vows mechanically, their voices devoid of emotion. When it came time for the rings, Emily's hands trembled slightly as she slipped the band onto Jake's finger. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the officiant declared. "You may kiss the bride." Jake hesitated, looking into Emily's eyes for the first time since the ceremony began. What he saw there wasn't hatred or disgust, as he'd expected, but a deep, profound sadness. Gently, he leaned in and placed a chaste kiss on her cheek. The guests applauded politely, but there was an undercurrent of discomfort. Everyone present knew this was no love match, no fairy tale ending. The reception that followed was a subdued affair. Emily and Jake sat at the head table, barely touching their food or speaking to each other. Richard made the rounds, shaking hands and accepting congratulations as if this were a normal wedding. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the lawn, Emily stood abruptly. "I need some air," she announced, not looking at Jake or her father as she strode away from the reception. Jake watched her go, feeling helpless. He caught Richard's eye across the room, receiving a subtle nod that clearly meant go after her. With a sigh, Jake stood and followed in Emily's wake. But he found her by the rose garden, her favorite spot on the estate. She stood with her back to him, her shoulders shaking slightly. It took Jake a moment to realize she was crying. "Emily," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. She whirled around, hastily wiping at her eyes. "What do you want?" she snapped. Jake held up his hands in a placating gesture. "I just wanted to make sure you were okay." Emily laughed bitterly. Okay? How could I possibly be okay? I've just been forced to marry a man I barely know, all because my father thinks he knows what's best for me. Jake stepped closer, his voice gentle. I know this isn't what either of us wanted, but we're in this together now. Maybe we can make the best of it. Emily looked at him, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time. She saw kindness in his eyes, a genuine desire to make things right. For a moment she allowed herself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, this arrangement might not be the disaster she'd anticipated. But then reality came crashing back. This wasn't a fairy tale, and Jake wasn't her Prince Charming. He was a pawn in her father's game, just as she was. There is no best of it, Jake, she said, her voice cold. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. Don't pretend it's anything else. With that, she brushed past him, heading back to the reception. Jake watched her go, a mix of emotions swirling within him. This was his wife now, for better or worse. And something told him that things were going to get a lot worse before they got better. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Jake made his way back to the reception, steeling himself for the life that lay ahead. A life bound to a woman who despised him, in a world he didn't understand. But he was determined to make it work somehow. After all, what other choice did he have? The first light of dawn was creeping through the curtains when Emily stirred, momentarily disoriented by her unfamiliar surroundings. As consciousness fully returned, so did the crushing reality of her situation. She was in the guest house, now her new home, lying next to a man she barely knew, her husband. Emily glanced over at Jake's sleeping form, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Even in sleep, there was a peacefulness about him that irritated her. How could he be so calm when their entire lives had been upended, his heirs had been upended? Careful not to wake him, Emily slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen. The guest house, while comfortable, was a far cry from the luxury she was accustomed to. No staff to prepare her morning coffee, no personal chef to whip up a gourmet breakfast. Just a small, modest kitchen that she barely knew how to navigate. After fumbling with the coffee maker for several frustrating minutes, Emily finally managed to brew a pot. She took her steaming mug out to the small porch, wrapping herself in a throw blanket against the early morning chill. The vineyard stretched out before her, bathed in the soft light of dawn. It was beautiful, she had to admit, but it felt like a gilded cage. This was to be her life now, trapped in this quaint little house, married to a man she didn't love, cut off from everything and everyone she knew. Morning, Jake's voice startled her out of her reverie. He stood in the doorway, already dressed in his work clothes, a mug of coffee in his hand. Emily didn't respond, keeping her gaze fixed on the vineyard. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. Look, I know this isn't ideal. Ideal? Emily scoffed, finally turning to face him. This is a nightmare. My entire life has been stolen from me, and you're complicit in it. Jake's face fell, hurt flashing in his eyes before he masked it. I didn't ask for this either, Emily, but we're both here now, so we might as well try to make the best of it. Emily stood abruptly, nearly spilling her coffee. Make the best of it? There is no best here, Jake. This is a prison sentence, nothing more. She brushed past him, retreating to the bedroom and slamming the door behind her. Jake stared after her, shoulders slumped in defeat. This was going to be harder than he'd imagined. Days passed in a similar fashion. Emily spent most of her time sulking in the guest house, refusing to engage with Jake or anyone else on the estate. She tried calling her friends, but her father had apparently gotten to them first. Her calls went unanswered, her text messages read, but never replied to. Jake, for his part, tried his best to make Emily comfortable. He brought her flowers from the garden, prepared meals when he could, and gave her space when she needed it. But his efforts were met with cold indifference at best and open hostility at worst. One evening, about a week into their marriage, Jake returned from work to find Emily sitting on the porch, an empty wine bottle at her feet. Emily, he approached cautiously. Are you okay? She looked up at him, her eyes glassy with alcohol and unshed tears. Am I okay? She laughed bitterly. What do you think, Jake? I'm trapped here, cut off from my friends, my life, everything I've ever known. How could I possibly be okay? Jake sat down beside her, maintaining a respectful distance. I know this is hard for you, he said softly, but maybe there's something good that can come out of this. Maybe we can learn from each other. Emily snorted derisively. Learn what? How to prune roses? How to live on a gardener's salary? No offense, Jake, but I'm not interested in your life lessons. Jake felt a flare of anger, quickly suppressed. And what about your life lessons, Emily? The endless parties, the reckless spending. Is that really the life you want? Emily stood up unsteadily, glaring down at him. You don't know anything about me or what I want. You're just a pawn in my father's game, nothing more." With that, she stormed back into the house, leaving Jake alone with his thoughts and the empty wine bottle. The next morning, Emily woke with a pounding headache and a gnawing sense of guilt. She'd been harsh with Jake, she knew. He was as much a victim in this situation as she was, but admitting that meant facing the reality of her situation, and she wasn't ready for that yet. She found Jake in the kitchen preparing breakfast. The smell of coffee and bacon filled the air, making her stomach growl despite her hangover. "I made enough for both of us," Jake said without turning around. "If you're hungry." Emily hesitated, then sat down at the small kitchen table. "Thanks," she mumbled. They ate in silence, the tension between them palpable. Finally, Jake spoke. "I have to work in the North Vineyard today. It's beautiful up there, if you wanted to come see it." Emily's first instinct was to refuse, to retreat back to the bedroom and wallow in her misery, but something stopped her. Maybe it was the genuine kindness in Jake's voice, or maybe she was just tired of staring at the same four walls. "Okay," she found herself saying, "I'll come." Surprise and pleasure flashed across Jake's face before he could hide it. "Great, we'll leave in about an hour." As they walked through the vineyard, Emily had to admit that Jake was right, it was beautiful. The vines stretched out in neat rows, heavy with ripening grapes. The air was fresh and clean, filled with the earthy scent of soil and green growing things. Jake moved among the vines with practiced ease, checking leaves and fruit with a careful eye. Emily watched him work, grudgingly impressed by his knowledge and skill. "How did you learn all this?" she asked, curiosity getting the better of her. Jake looked up, a small smile on his face. "I've been working in vineyards since I was a teenager. Started as a summer job, but I fell in love with it. There's something satisfying about nurturing something, watching it grow." Emily nodded, not quite understanding but appreciating his passion. "I guess I never really thought about where the wine comes from. To me, it was just there." Jake's smile widened. "There's a lot more to it than most people realize. Here, let me show you." He guided her through the process, explaining how they cared for the vines, when to harvest the grapes, how the terroir affected the flavor of the wine. Emily found herself genuinely interested, asking questions and even laughing at Jake's corny wine puns. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the vineyard, Emily realized she'd spent the entire day outside. For the first time since her forced marriage, she felt, not happy, exactly, but something close to content. "Thank you," she said quietly as they walked back to the guest house. "For today, it was nice." Jake nodded, a warm smile on his face. "I'm glad you enjoyed it. There's a lot more to see, if you're interested." Emily hesitated, old habits of resistance warring with her newfound curiosity. "Maybe," she said finally, "we'll see." That night, as Emily lay in bed, she found herself reflecting on the day. Jake wasn't what she'd expected. He was kind, patient, and surprisingly intelligent. She'd always dismissed the estate workers as beneath her notice, but Jake had shown her a world she'd never really seen before. But even as she acknowledged these thoughts, another part of her rebelled. This wasn't her life, her choice. She couldn't let herself be seduced by the simple charms of vineyard life. She was Emily Collins, socialite and heiress, not some farmer's wife. The conflict within her raged on, leaving her tossing and turning long into the night. Over the next few weeks, a tentative routine began to establish itself. Emily started joining Jake on his rounds of the vineyard more often, learning about the wine-making process and even helping out with small tasks. She found, to her surprise, that the work was satisfying in a way her previous life of parties and shopping had never been. But there were still moments of tension, of resentment. Emily missed her old life fiercely, the freedom and excitement of it. She chafed at the restrictions placed on her, the constant presence of her father's watchful eyes, even when he wasn't physically present. Jake, for his part, was patient and kind, but he too struggled with the situation. He wasn't used to having someone constantly in his space, questioning his methods and disrupting his routines. And despite the moments of connection they shared, there was always an underlying current of awkwardness, a reminder that their marriage was built on coercion rather than love. As the days turned into weeks, both Emily and Jake found themselves grappling with unexpected emotions. Emily was surprised to find herself looking forward to their time together in the vineyard, while Jake caught himself admiring Emily's quick wit and determination. But neither of them was ready to confront these feelings, to admit that perhaps this forced union wasn't as terrible as they'd first thought. Instead, they continued to dance around each other, two people trapped in an impossible situation, trying to find their footing in a world that had been turned upside down. Little did they know that their tentative peace was about to be shattered, as forces beyond their control conspired to test their fledgling relationship in ways they could never have anticipated. As the weeks turned into months, Emily found herself settling into a routine that would have been unthinkable to her former self. She woke early, often before the sun rose, joining Jake for a quiet cup of coffee on the porch before he headed out to work. The pre-dawn stillness, once oppressive, now felt peaceful. One crisp autumn morning, as they sat in companionable silence watching the mist rise off the vineyard, Jake turned to her with a hesitant smile. "I was thinking," he began, "would you like to learn how to prune the vines today?" Emily's first instinct was to refuse. Manual labor had never been her forte, but something in Jake's hopeful expression made her pause. I guess I could try," she found herself saying. Jake's face lit up with a genuine smile, a sight that was becoming increasingly common, and Emily had to admit, rather appealing. "Great. I'll show you the ropes after breakfast." Later that morning, Emily found herself standing in the vineyard, pruning shears in hand, listening intently as Jake explained the intricacies of vine management. "The key," Jake said, demonstrating with practiced ease, "is to cut away the old growth to make room for the new. It might seem harsh, but it's necessary for the health of the vine and the quality of the grapes." As Emily made her first tentative cuts, she couldn't help but see the metaphor in Jake's words. Wasn't that what was happening in her own life? The old, frivolous parts of herself being pruned away, making room for what? She was so lost in thought that she nearly cut off a vital shoot. Jake's hand caught hers just in time, his touch warm and steady. "Careful," he said softly. "You want to preserve the strongest branches." Emily looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. For a moment, neither of them moved, caught in each other's gaze. Then, as if by mutual agreement, they stepped apart, both a little flushed. "Sorry," Emily mumbled. "I'll be more careful." Jake nodded, clearing his throat. "No worries, it takes practice." As the day wore on, Emily found herself enjoying the work more than she'd expected. There was something satisfying about the physical labor, the tangible results of her efforts visible in the neatly trimmed vines. By the time the sun began to set, she was tired but oddly invigorated. "You did well today," Jake said as they walked back to the guest house. "You're a natural." Emily felt a flutter of pride at his words. "Thanks. It was nice, different but nice." That night, as she soaked in a hot bath to ease her aching muscles, Emily reflected on the day. She'd always defined herself by her social status, her expensive clothes, her wild parties. But today, covered in dirt and sweat, she'd felt a sense of accomplishment that all her designer shopping sprees had never provided. As the days passed, Emily found herself more and more involved in the workings of the vineyard. She learned about soil composition, pest management, and the delicate balance of flavors that made a truly great wine. To her surprise, she discovered she had a good palate, able to discern subtle notes that even some of the more experienced workers missed. One evening, as they sat on the porch enjoying a glass of wine from the previous year's harvest, Jake turned to her with a serious expression. "Emily," he said, "I've been thinking. You've really taken to the vineyard work. How would you feel about taking on more responsibility? Maybe overseeing the tasting room?" Emily was taken aback. "Me? But I mean I'm still learning." Jake shook his head, smiling. "You know more than you think, and you have a natural talent for it. Plus, your background in hospitality could be really valuable." Emily felt a warm glow of pride at his words. For the first time in her life, someone was valuing her for her skills and hard work, not just her family name or her looks. I'd like that," she said softly. "Thank you, Jake." He reached out and squeezed her hand gently. "You've earned it." As Emily threw herself into her new role, she found a sense of purpose she'd never known before. She revamped the tasting room, drawing on her knowledge of high-end hospitality to create an experience that was both luxurious and authentic. Under her guidance, the vineyard's direct sales increased dramatically. One day, as she was leading a tasting for a group of wine critics, she caught sight of Jake watching her from the doorway. The pride in his eyes made her heart skip a beat. When had his opinion started to matter so much to her? Later that evening, as they walked through the moonlit vineyard, Jake turned to her with a smile. "You were amazing today," he said. "The way you handled those critics, I've never seen anything like it." Emily felt herself blushing. It wasn't that impressive, she demurred. Jake stopped walking, turning to face her. "It was," he insisted. "Emily, you've come so far. When you first came here, you were a spoiled brat." Emily supplied with a self-deprecating laugh. Jake shook his head. "Lost," he said softly. "You were lost. But now you found yourself, and it's beautiful to see." Emily's breath caught in her throat. The moonlight cast a soft glow on Jake's face, highlighting the warmth in his eyes. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine leaning in, closing the distance between them. But the moment passed, and they continued their walk in silence, both acutely aware of the unspoken emotions swirling between them. As autumn turned to winter, Emily found herself genuinely enjoying her new life. She still missed aspects of her old world, the excitement, the glamour, but it no longer consumed her thoughts. Instead, she found joy in simple pleasures, the satisfaction of a job well done, the beauty of a winter sunrise over the frost-covered vines, the warmth of Jake's smile when she mastered a new skill. One cold December evening, as they sat by the fireplace in the guest house, Emily realized with a start that she was happy. Not the fleeting happiness of a shopping spree or a wild party, but a deep, abiding contentment. "Jake," she said softly, breaking the comfortable silence, "I want to thank you." And he looked up from the book he was reading, a quizzical expression on his face. "For what?" Emily took a deep breath. "For everything. For being patient with me when I was at my worst. For teaching me, for believing in me. I don't know who I'd be right now if it weren't for you." Jake set his book aside, his expression serious. "Emily, you did all of that yourself. I just provided the opportunity." She shook her head. "It was more than that. You saw something in me that I didn't even see in myself, and you gave me a chance when you had every reason not to." Jake reached out, taking her hand in his. "You're an amazing woman, Emily. I always knew that, but I'm just glad you finally realized it too." As they sat there, hands intertwined, Emily felt a surge of emotion she couldn't quite name. It wasn't the passionate infatuation she'd felt for countless men in her past. It was something deeper, more profound, something that both thrilled and terrified her. But before she could examine these feelings too closely, the moment was interrupted by a knock at the door. Jake went to answer it, returning with a troubled expression. "It's your father," he said. "He wants to see you. Both of us, actually." Emily felt a chill run down her spine. In the months she'd been living on the estate, she'd had minimal contact with her father. What could he want now? As they made their way to the main house, Emily's mind raced with possibilities. Had her father finally decided to end this forced marriage? Was he going to cut her off completely? Or was there something else, something she couldn't even imagine? Whatever it was, Emily realized with a start she was no longer the same woman who had been forced into this marriage months ago. She was stronger now, more confident in herself and her abilities. Whatever her father had to say, she would face it with Jake by her side. As they entered Richard Collins' study, Emily squared her shoulders, ready to confront whatever challenges lay ahead. Little did she know the conversation they were about to have would test her newfound strength in ways she could never have anticipated. The tension in Richard Collins' study was palpable as Emily and Jake entered. Richard sat behind his imposing desk, his face an unreadable mask, but it wasn't her father that made Emily's breath catch in her throat. It was the man standing by the window, his back to them as he gazed out over the vineyard. "Emily," Richard said, his voice carefully neutral. "Jake, thank you for coming. We have a situation that needs to be addressed." At the sound of Richard's voice, the man by the window turned, and Emily felt as if the floor had dropped out from under her. She knew that face, those piercing blue eyes, that roguish smile that had once made her weak at the knees. "Alex," she whispered, her voice a mixture of shock and something else, something she didn't want to examine too closely. Alex Drake, her ex-boyfriend, the man she'd been dating when her father had forced her into this marriage, stood before her, looking as devastatingly handsome as ever in his tailored suit. "Hello, Emily," Alex said, his voice smooth as silk. "It's been a while." Jake tensed beside her, and Emily realized she'd instinctively taken a step towards Alex. She forced herself to stay put, acutely aware of Jake's presence at her side. "What's going on?" Emily demanded, turning to her father. "Why is Alex here?" Richard leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "Mr. Drake has made an interesting proposition, one that I think merits discussion." Alex stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Emily's face. "I've come to make things right, Em. To take you home." Emily felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. Home, the word evoked memories of her old life, the parties, the freedom, the excitement. For a moment she was transported back to a world of glittering lights and endless possibilities. But then she felt Jake shift beside her, and reality came crashing back. This was her home now, wasn't it? "What are you talking about, Alex?" Emily asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. Alex moved closer, and Emily caught a whiff of his expensive cologne. "I've been working on a deal, Em. A big one. I've got backing from some major players in the tech world. We're talking billions, and I want you by my side when it all comes together." Emily's head was spinning. Billions? It was the kind of money that even her father would have to respect, the kind of deal that could change everything. "I don't understand," she said, glancing between Alex and her father. "What does this have to do with my current situation?" It was Richard who answered. "Mr. Drake has made a compelling case for dissolving your marriage to Jake. In light of his new financial status, I'm inclined to reconsider my previous decision." Emily felt as if she'd been slapped. She turned to Jake, expecting to see hurt or anger in his eyes. Instead, she saw resignation, as if he'd always been waiting for this moment. "Jake," she began, but he cut her off with a small shake of his head. "It's okay, Emily," he said softly. "I always knew this was temporary, that someday you'd go back to your real life." His words, meant to be kind, cut her to the core. Was this just temporary? Was the life she'd built here, the person she'd become, not real? Alex stepped closer, taking her hand in his. "Come on, Em. This isn't you. Playing at being a farmer's wife. You were meant for so much more. Come back to the city with me. We'll take on the world together, just like we always planned." Emily's mind was reeling. Just a few months ago, she would have jumped at this chance. She would have seen it as a rescue, an escape from the prison her father had created for her. But now, she looked at Jake, really looked at him. She saw the kindness in his eyes, the strength in his calloused hands. She thought of the early mornings in the vineyard, the satisfaction of a hard day's work, the quiet evenings by the fire. She thought of the woman she'd become, stronger, more confident, more real than she'd ever been in her old life. But she also couldn't deny the pull she felt towards Alex, towards the life he was offering. The excitement, the challenge, the chance to prove herself on a global stage. It was intoxicating. I need time to think," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded, as if he'd expected this response. "Of course. Take the night to consider Mr. Drake's offer. We'll reconvene in the morning to make a final decision." As they left the study, Emily felt as if she were sleepwalking. Jake walked beside her in silence, his face unreadable. Alex followed a few steps behind, his presence a tangible force at her back. When they reached the guest house, Jake turned to her. "I'll sleep on the couch tonight," he said quietly. "Give you some space to think." Before Emily could respond, he disappeared inside, leaving her alone with Alex. "Oh, so," Alex said, a hint of his old charm creeping into his voice. "Can I interest you in a walk down memory lane, for old time's sake?" Emily hesitated. She knew she should say no, should go inside and really think about her decision. But a part of her, the part that still yearned for her old life, couldn't resist. "The walk," she said firmly, "that's all." As they strolled through the moonlit vineyard, Alex regaled her with tales of his latest adventures, of the deals he'd made and the worlds he'd conquered. Emily found herself laughing at his stories, falling into the easy rhythm they'd once shared. But as they walked, she couldn't shake the image of Jake's face as he'd offered to sleep on the couch, the quiet dignity in his resignation, the unspoken pain in his eyes. As they circled back to the guest house, Alex stopped, turning to face her. "I've missed you, Em," he said softly, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind her Seronzig. "We were good together, weren't we? We could be again." Emily felt her heart racing. This was the moment in all those romantic movies where the heroine falls back into the arms of her true love. But as Alex leaned in, his intention clear, Emily found herself taking a step back. "I'm sorry, Alex," she said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "I need to think, alone." She turned and walked into the guest house, leaving Alex standing in the moonlight. As she closed the door behind her, Emily leaned against it, her mind and heart in turmoil. In the quiet of the night, with Jake's steady breathing coming to the living room, and the memory of Alex's cologne still lingering in her nostrils, Emily faced the most important decision of her life. A decision that would shape not just her future, but the very essence of who she was. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, matching Emily's tumultuous mood. She had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of Jake, Alex, and the life-altering decision that lay before her. As she stepped out onto the porch, she found Jake already there, 2 steaming mugs of coffee in hand. "I thought you might need this," he said softly, offering her a mug. Emily accepted it gratefully, their fingers brushing in the exchange. The familiar gesture, once so comfortable, now felt charged with unspoken tension. "Jake," Emily began, her voice hesitant, "about last night." Jake held up a hand, stopping her. "Emily, before you say anything, there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you a long time ago." Emily felt a flutter of apprehension in her stomach. "What is it?" Jake took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the misty vineyard before them. I haven't been entirely honest with you about who I am." Emily's heart began to race. "What do you mean?" Jake turned to face her, his expression a mix of guilt and determination. "My name isn't just Jake. It's Jacob Thornton. I. The name hit Emily like a physical blow. Thornton. As in Thornton Enterprises, one of the largest tech conglomerates in the world. But that would mean, Emily stammered, her mind struggling to process this revelation. Jake nodded, a rueful smile on his face. "Yes, I'm the heir to the Thornton fortune, or at least I was." Emily sank into a chair, her legs suddenly weak. "I don't understand. If you're a Thornton, why are you here, working as a gardener?" Jake sat down next to her, his eyes distant as he began his story. 3 years ago, I was exactly who you'd expect a Thornton heir to be. Arrogant, reckless, more concerned with partying than anything else. But then there was an accident. Emily listened in stunned silence as Jake recounted a night of drunk driving that had ended in tragedy. No one had died, but a young woman had been severely injured. Jake's family had used their influence to keep his name out of the papers, but the guilt had eaten away at him. "I couldn't face myself," Jake continued, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't face the person I'd become. So I left, walked away from everything. I wanted to find a place where I could do honest work, where I could make amends in some small way." Emily's mind was reeling. All this time Jake had been hiding this secret. He wasn't just a simple gardener, he was a man running from a past as complicated and privileged as her own. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, a hint of hurt in her voice. Jake turned to her, his eyes pleading for understanding. "At first it was because I didn't trust you, and you were so much like who I used to be. But then I fell in love with you, Emily, and I was afraid that if you knew the truth you'd see me differently, that you'd want the old Jake, the rich heir, not the man I've become." Emily's breath caught in her throat. Love, he'd said love, and suddenly, with crystal clarity, she realized she felt the same way. But before she could respond, a new voice cut through the morning air. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Emily and Jake both turned to see Alex standing at the edge of the porch, his expression a mix of anger and triumph. "I knew there was something off about you," Alex sneered at Jake, "so I did some digging. Imagine my surprise when I found out that the humble gardener was actually Jacob Thornton. I. Jake stood, his posture tense. "How did you find out?" Alex smirked. "Money talks, Jake, or should I say Jacob. It wasn't hard to trace your steps once I knew where to look." Emily stood as well, moving to stand beside Jake. "What do you want, Alex?" Alex's eyes glittered dangerously. "What I've always wanted, you. And now that the playing field is level, I think it's time you made your choice. The man you loved before all this, or the liar who's been pretending to be something he's not." Emily felt anger bubbling up inside her. Jake didn't lie, he just omitted some parts of his past. "Semantics," Alex scoffed. "The point is, Emily, you don't owe him anything. You can walk away right now, come back to the real world with me." Emily looked between the two men, both watching her intently. Alex, with his polished charm and promises of excitement, and Jake, with his quiet strength and the love that shone in his eyes. In that moment, Emily realized that the choice wasn't really about Alex or Jake. It was about who she wanted to be. The old Emily who chased thrills and lived for the moment, or the woman she'd become here, someone with depth, purpose, and real happiness. "I'm sorry, Alex," she said, her voice steady and sure. "But I'm not going anywhere. This is my real world now." Alex's face darkened with anger. "You're making a mistake, Emily. You're choosing a life of obscurity with a man who lied to you." Emily shook her head. "No, I'm choosing a life of meaning with a man who showed me what real love looks like." She turned to Jake, taking his hand in hers. "I love you, Jake. Your past doesn't change that. If anything, knowing what you've overcome just makes me love you more." Jake's eyes shone with unshed tears as he pulled Emily into a tight embrace. Over his shoulder, she saw Alex storm off, disappearing down the path towards the main house. As they stood there, holding each other in the misty morning light, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. The decision she'd agonized over all night suddenly seemed so simple, so clear. This was where she belonged, with Jake in this vineyard, building a life of purpose and love. Whatever challenges lay ahead, whatever secrets still remained to be revealed, she knew they would face them together. As the sun finally broke through the clouds, bathing the vineyard in golden light, Emily and Jake shared a kiss that felt like a new beginning. The past was behind them and the future, with all its possibilities, lay open before them. The weeks following Jake's revelation and Emily's decision were filled with a newfound sense of peace and purpose. Their relationship now built on honesty and mutual understanding, blossomed in ways neither of them had anticipated. The vineyard, too, seemed to thrive under their combined care and attention. However, their idyllic existence was about to face its greatest challenge yet. It started with a letter. Emily was sorting through the mail one morning when she came across an official-looking envelope addressed to Richard Collins. Normally, she wouldn't have given it a second glance, but the logo on the corner caught her eye, Riverdale Development Corp. A sense of unease settled in her stomach as she brought the letter to her father's study. Richard's face grew increasingly grim as he read its contents. "Dad?" Emily asked, concern evident in her voice. "What is it?" Richard sighed heavily, removing his reading glasses. "It seems Riverdale Development has made an offer to buy the estate. They want to turn the entire valley into a luxury resort complex." Emily felt as if the wind had been knocked out of her. But they can't do that, can they? This land has been in our family for generations." Richard's expression was grave. "They're offering an astronomical sum, Emily. And they're not just approaching us. They're trying to buy out every vineyard in the valley." The implications of this hit Emily like a ton of bricks. If Riverdale succeeded, it wouldn't just be their home and livelihood at stake, but the entire wine-making community in the valley. "We have to stop them," Emily said, determination hardening her voice. Richard looked at her with a mix of pride and resignation. "It's not that simple, sweetheart. Many of our neighbors are struggling. This offer could be a lifeline for them." Emily left her father's study with a heavy heart. She found Jake working in the greenhouse, humming softly to himself as he tended to the young vines. When she told him about Riverdale's offer, Jake's usually calm demeanor gave way to anger. "They can't do this," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "This land, this way of life, it means everything to the people here." Emily nodded, feeling a surge of affection for this man who had come to love the vineyard as much as she did. "We need to do something," she said. "But what?" Over the next few days, Emily and Jake threw themselves into researching Riverdale development and rallying the local community. They organized meetings with other vineyard owners, reached out to local conservation groups, and even started a social media campaign to raise awareness about the threat to the valleys. Their efforts didn't go unnoticed. One evening, as they were returning from a community meeting, they found Alex waiting for them at the guest house. "I hear you've been making waves," he said, his tone casual but his eyes sharp. Emily tensed, stepping closer to Jake. "What do you want, Alex?" Alex smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I'm here to offer you a deal, on behalf of Riverdale Development." The pieces suddenly fell into place in Emily's mind. "You're working for them," she said, the accusation clear in her voice. Alex shrugged, unapologetic. "I'm an investor. And I'm here to tell you that you're fighting a losing battle. Riverdale always gets what it wants." "Not this time," Jake said firmly. "This valley, these vineyards, they're not just land to be bought and sold. They're people's homes, their livelihoods, their legacies." Alex's smile turned cold. "Noble sentiments, but sentiment doesn't pay the bills. Many of your neighbors are drowning in debt. Our offer is their only way out." "There has to be another way," Emily insisted. "There isn't," Alex said flatly. "But I'm prepared to make you a personal offer, Emily. Come work for Riverdale. With your knowledge of the wine industry and your connections, you could be an invaluable asset. We'll make sure you're generously compensated." For a brief moment, Emily was tempted. The offer represented a return to the world of high stakes and big money that she had once thrived in. But then she looked at Jake, at the vineyard stretching out behind him, and she knew her answer. "No," she said firmly. "I won't help you destroy something beautiful for the sake of profit." Alex's face hardened. "Don't be a fool, Emily. You can't win this fight." "Maybe not," Emily replied, "but we're sure as hell going to try." After Alex left, Emily and Jake sat on the porch, the weight of the challenge before them settling heavily on their shoulders. "What are we going to do?" Emily asked, her voice small in the gathering darkness. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the vineyard. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face. "I think," he said, "it's time I stopped running from my past." Emily looked at him quizzically. "What do you mean?" Jake turned to her, determination shining in his eyes. "The Thornton Foundation. It was set up by my great-grandfather to support sustainable agriculture. I've avoided anything to do with my family for years, but maybe it's time I embraced that legacy, for the right reasons." Hope bloomed in Emily's chest. "Do you think they'd help?" Jake nodded. "It's exactly the kind of project they look for. We could set up a fund to help the struggling vineyards, maybe even establish a co-op to strengthen the whole community." Emily felt a surge of excitement. "And we could use my marketing experience to rebrand the valley, attract more tourism, make the vineyards profitable again." And as they talked late into the night, their plan taking shape, Emily marveled at how far she'd come. Months ago, she would have jumped at Alex's offer, seeing only the personal gain. Now she was ready to fight not just for herself, but for an entire community. The battle ahead would be tough. Riverdale Development had deep pockets and a ruthless reputation. But as Emily looked at Jake, saw the passion and determination in his eyes, she knew they stood a fighting chance. Together, they were no longer just two people thrown together by circumstance. They were partners united in purpose, ready to take on whatever challenges lay ahead. As the first light of dawn broke over the vineyard, Emily felt a sense of hope and determination stronger than anything she'd ever known. The fight for the valley had just begun, and they were ready for it. The morning after their late-night planning session, Emily stood outside her father's study, her heart pounding. She knew the conversation she was about to have could change everything. Taking a deep breath, she knocked on the door. "Come in," Richard's voice called from inside. Emily entered, finding her father behind his desk, surrounded by papers and looking more stressed than she'd ever seen him. "Dad," she said, her voice steady despite her nerves, "we need to talk." Richard looked up, his expression a mixture of exhaustion and resignation. "If this is about Riverdale's offer, Emily, I'm not sure there's much left to discuss." "That's where you're wrong," Emily said, taking a seat across from him. "Jake and I have a plan." She laid out their idea, using the Thornton Foundation to set up a fund for struggling vineyards, establishing a co-op, rebranding the valley to attract more tourism. As she spoke, she saw a glimmer of interest in her father's eyes. When she finished, Richard was quiet for a long moment. "It's an ambitious plan," he said finally. "But Emily, you have to understand the scale of what we're up against. Riverdale isn't just offering to buy the land, they're promising jobs, economic growth. Many people in the valley see this as their only way forward." Emily leaned forward, her eyes blazing with determination. "But at what cost, Dad? This valley isn't just land to be bought and sold. It's our heritage, our home. Are we really willing to trade that for a bunch of golf courses and overpriced hotels?" Richard sighed, rubbing his temples. "It's not that simple, sweetheart. We have a responsibility to our employees, to the community. If we can't keep the vineyards profitable, then we'll make them profitable," Emily interjected. "Dad, you didn't build this business by giving up when things got tough. You innovated, you adapted. That's what we need to do now." She saw a flicker of the old Richard Collins in her father's eyes, the ambitious, determined man who had turned a small family vineyard into a thriving enterprise. But then doubt clouded his face again. "Even if we could make this work," he said, "we'd be going up against a powerful corporation. The risk is enormous." Emily took a deep breath, knowing she was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "And maybe it's time to take a risk for something that matters. Dad, when you forced me to marry Jake, you said it was to teach me responsibility. Well, this is me taking responsibility, not just for myself, but for our family legacy, for this entire community." Richard stared at her, clearly taken aback by her words. "Emily, But Emily wasn't finished. Years of pent-up emotion came pouring out. "You've always tried to control my life, Dad. You thought you knew what was best for me. But you know what? You were wrong. Marrying Jake, learning about this business, falling in love with this land, it's changed me, for the better. And now I'm asking you to trust me, to believe in me just this once." The study fell silent. Emily could hear her heart pounding in her ears as she waited for her father's response. Richard stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the vineyard. For a long moment he said nothing, just gazed out at the land that had been in their family for generations. When he finally turned back to Emily, there was a new look in his eyes, one of respect, and perhaps a hint of regret. "You're right," he said softly. "I have tried to control you. I thought I was protecting you, but maybe I was just afraid of letting you grow up." Emily felt tears pricking at her eyes. This was a side of her father she'd never seen before. "Dad." Richard held up a hand. "Let me finish. When I forced you to marry Jake, I thought I was teaching you a lesson. But it seems you've taught me one instead. You've shown me a strength and determination I didn't know you had. And maybe it's time I started listening to you." Emily's heart soared. "Does this mean you'll support our plan?" Richard nodded slowly. "It won't be easy. We'll be risking everything. But you're right, this land, this legacy, it's worth fighting for. So yes, I'll support you, on one condition." "What's that?" Emily asked, hardly daring to believe this was real. "That you take the lead on this project," Richard said. "If we're going to reinvent this business, we need new blood, new ideas. I think you're ready for that responsibility, if you want it." Emily felt a wave of emotion wash over her. This was more than she'd ever hoped for, not just her father's support, but his trust, his belief in her abilities. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, I want it." Richard smiled, a real warm smile that Emily hadn't seen in years. "Then let's get to work. We have a valley to save." As Emily left the study, her mind was reeling. She'd come in expecting a fight, maybe even a final break with her father. Instead, she'd found understanding, respect, and a new partnership. She found Jake waiting for her in the hallway, his face etched with concern. "How did it go?" he asked anxiously. Emily couldn't contain her smile. "He's on board," she said, "and he's putting me in charge of the whole project." Jake's face lit up with pride and love. He swept her into his arms, spinning her around in celebration. "And I knew you could do it," he said. "You're amazing, Emily Collins." As Jake set her down, Emily felt a surge of love for this man who had stood by her, who had believed in her even when she didn't believe in herself. "We did this together," she said softly, "and we'll save this valley together." They shared a kiss, full of promise and hope for the future. As they broke apart, Emily knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as a team, not just the two of them, but her father, and hopefully soon, the entire community. The fight for the valley was just beginning, but for the first time, Emily felt truly ready for it. She had found her purpose, her strength, and a love that would sustain her through whatever lay ahead. The Emily who had arrived at the vineyard months ago, as a reluctant bride, was gone. In her place stood a woman ready to take on the world, one grape at a time. The weeks following Emily's breakthrough with her father were a whirlwind of activity. Emily threw herself into the fight to save the valley with a passion that surprised even herself. She organized community meetings, reached out to potential investors, and worked tirelessly on a comprehensive plan to revitalize the local wine industry. Jake was by her side every step of the way, offering support, insight, and encouragement. His connections through the Thornton Foundation proved invaluable, opening doors that might otherwise have remained closed. However, as the pressure mounted and the stakes grew higher, cracks began to appear in their relationship. The long hours and constant stress started to take their toll, and the easy companionship they had once shared began to feel strained. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of negotiations with local vineyard owners, Emily returned to the guest house to find Jake sitting on the porch, a troubled expression on his face. "Hey," she said, dropping her bag and collapsing into the chair next to him. "Tough day?" Jake nodded, his eyes fixed on the darkening vineyard. "Emily, we need to talk." The seriousness in his tone made Emily sit up straighter. "What's wrong?" Jake turned to face her, his expression a mix of concern and frustration. "When was the last time we had a conversation that wasn't about saving the valley? When was the last time we just were together without an agenda or a plan?" Emily opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again. She realized with a start that she couldn't remember. The fight to save the valley had consumed every waking moment. "Jake, she began, but he cut her off. "I know this is important, Emily. I know we're fighting for something bigger than ourselves, but I feel like we're losing us in the process." His words hit Emily like a physical blow. She had been so focused on the goal, so determined to prove herself, that she had neglected the very relationship that had given her the strength to take on this fight in the first place. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "I didn't realize I've been so caught up in everything." Jake reached out and took her hand. "I understand, and I'm proud of you, Emily. The way you've taken charge, the passion you've shown, it's incredible. But I miss you. I miss us." Emily felt tears pricking at her eyes. "I miss us too," she admitted. I don't know how to balance it all. This fight, it feels like life or death sometimes." Jake nodded. "I know, but we can't lose sight of why we're doing this. We're fighting for a future, Emily. Our future. If we lose ourselves along the way, what's the point?" As they sat in silence, the weight of Jake's words settling between them, a new voice broke the quiet of the evening. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Emily and Jake both turned to see a woman standing at the edge of the porch. She was strikingly beautiful, with long dark hair and piercing green eyes, but it was the familiarity with which she looked at Jake that made Emily's heart clench. Jake stood abruptly, his face a mask of shock. "Sarah, what are you doing here?" The woman Sarah smiled, but there was a hint of something almost predatory in her expression. "Hello, Jacob. It's been a long time." Emily stood as well, moving closer to Jake almost instinctively. "Jake, who is this?" Jake's voice was strained as he made the introductions. "Emily, this is Sarah Blackwood. We used to date. Back in my old life." Sarah's smile widened. "Oh, we were more than that, weren't we, Jacob? We were engaged." Emily felt as if the ground had dropped out from under her. Engaged. Jake had never mentioned an engagement. "That was a long time ago," Jake said firmly. "Sarah, why are you here?" Sarah's eyes flickered to Emily before returning to Jake. I heard about your little crusade to save this quaint valley. I thought you might need some help. The Blackwood family still has considerable influence, you know." Emily found her voice at last. "We appreciate the offer, but we have things under control." Sarah laughed, a tinkling sound that somehow managed to be both musical and mocking. "Oh, sweetie, you have no idea what you're up against. Jacob, darling, why don't we discuss this over dinner? For old time's sake." Jake hesitated, glancing at Emily. In that moment of hesitation, Emily felt a chasm opening between them. All the insecurities she thought she'd left behind came rushing back. Jake had a past, a whole life she knew nothing about. And now that past was standing on their porch, offering a glimpse of the world he'd left behind. "I think you should go," Emily said quietly. Both Jake and Sarah turned to look at her in surprise. Jake began, but she cut him off. "No, really. You two obviously have a lot to catch up on. And Sarah's right, we could use all the help we can get. So go, have dinner. Talk about old times." The hurt in Jake's eyes was palpable, but Emily couldn't bring herself to take back her words. She felt raw, exposed, and desperately in need of some time alone to process everything. "Emily, please," Jake said softly. "Don't do this." But Emily had already turned away, heading into the house. She closed the door behind her, leaning against it as she heard Jake and Sarah's voices fade into the distance. As the sound of Sarah's car engine faded away, Emily sank to the floor, tears finally spilling over. She had thought she and Jake were in this together, that they were building something unbreakable. But now, with the appearance of this ghost from Jake's past, all her old doubts and fears came rushing back. Was she really cut out for this life? Could she ever truly belong in Jake's world? And most terrifyingly of all, now that Jake had a glimpse of his old life back, would he still choose her? As night fell over the vineyard, Emily sat alone in the darkening house, facing the biggest crisis of faith she'd encountered since this journey began. The valley wasn't the only thing at stake anymore. Now, she was fighting for her relationship, for the future she and Jake had dreamed of together. And for the first time since this all began, Emily wasn't sure if she had the strength to win this battle. The night stretched endlessly for Emily as she waited for Jake's return. Every creak of the old house, every rustle of wind through the vineyard made her heart race with anticipation and dread. When she finally heard the sound of tires on gravel, she steeled herself for whatever was to come. Jake entered the house quietly, his footsteps hesitant. He found Emily curled up on the couch, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. "Emily," he said softly, his voice filled with regret. "We need to talk." Emily sat up, wrapping her arms around herself as if for protection. "Did you have a nice dinner with Sarah?" she asked, unable to keep the bitterness from her voice. Jake sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I didn't go to dinner with her, Emily. I told her to leave." Surprise flickered across Emily's face. "You didn't go." Jake shook his head, moving to sit beside her on the couch. "How could I? Emily, you're the only person I want to have dinner with, to talk to share my life with." And Emily felt a glimmer of hope, but the pain and insecurity of the past few hours weren't so easily dismissed. "Then why didn't you tell me about her? About your engagement?" Jake was quiet for a moment, gathering his thoughts. "Because it felt like another lifetime," he said finally. "When I left my old life behind, I left everything, including Sarah. I thought that part of my life was over." "But it's not, is it?" Emily said softly. "Your past is always going to be there, Jake, and I feel like I don't know anything about it." Jake reached out, taking Emily's hand in his. "You're right, I should have told you everything from the beginning. When I was afraid." "Afraid of what?" "Afraid that if you saw all of me, the good and the bad, you might not want me anymore," Jake admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily felt her heart soften at his vulnerability. "Jake, I fell in love with you, all of you. The man you are now, the man you used to be, they're both part of you, and I want to know every part." Jake's eyes shimmered with unshed tears. "I love you, Emily. More than I've ever loved anyone. What I had with Sarah, it was part of my old life. A life of privilege and excess, where nothing felt real. But with you, everything is real. Sometimes terrifyingly so." Emily couldn't help but smile at that. "Tell me about it," she said, thinking of their current fight to save the valley. Jake took a deep breath. "I owe you the whole truth. About Sarah, about my past, about everything. Are you ready to hear it?" Emily nodded, settling in closer to Jake. For the next few hours, Jake opened up completely, sharing stories of his childhood, his wild years as a Thornton heir, his relationship with Sarah, and the accident that had changed everything. He spoke of his guilt, his desire for redemption, and how working in the vineyard had slowly healed his soul. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the windows, Jake finished his story. "And then I met you," he said, his voice filled with wonder. and for the first time in my life I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be." Emily wiped away tears, overwhelmed by Jake's honesty and the depth of his feelings for her. "Thank you," she said softly, "for sharing all of that with me, for trusting me with your past." Jake pulled her close, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "I'm sorry it took me so long. I promise, from now on, no more secrets. You have all of me, Emily, past, present, and future." Emily looked up at him, her heart full of love and a newfound understanding. "And you have all of me, Jake, including the stubborn, workaholic parts that sometimes forget what's really important." Jake chuckled, the sound rumbling through his chest. "I wouldn't have you any other way, but maybe we can work on finding a better balance." Emily nodded, snuggling closer to him. "Definitely. Starting now, what do you say we take the day off? No work, no saving the valley, just us." Jake's face lit up with a smile. "That sounds perfect. What did you have in mind?" Emily grinned mischievously. "Well, I seem to remember a certain someone promising to teach me how to make wine the old-fashioned way. Something about stomping grapes with our bare feet." Jake laughed, the joy in his voice washing away the last of the tension between them. "Your wish is my command, Mrs. Thornton." As they spent the day together, laughing and playing in the vineyard like children, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. The challenges they faced, saving the valley, navigating their pasts, building a future together, were still there, but now she felt more equipped than ever to face them. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Emily turned to Jake with a serious expression. "I think I'm ready," she said. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Ready for what?" "To face Riverdale development. To fight for this valley with everything we've got. But this time we do it together, as partners, in every sense of the word." Jake's eyes shone with pride and love. Together, he agreed, sealing the promise with a kiss. As the stars began to twinkle in the darkening sky, Emily and Jake sat in comfortable silence, their fingers intertwined. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and unexpected turns. But Emily knew that as long as she had Jake by her side, there was nothing they couldn't face. The girl who had arrived at the vineyard months ago as a reluctant bride was gone. In her place was a woman who had found her purpose, her strength, and a love deeper and truer than anything she had ever known. Whatever the future held, Emily was ready to embrace it, with Jake, with her newfound family in the valley, and with the unwavering determination that had become her hallmark. As they headed inside, hand in hand, Emily felt a sense of excitement for what lay ahead. The fight for the valley was far from over, but with their love reaffirmed and their partnership stronger than ever, she knew that they were ready for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. The morning of Emily and Jake's vow renewal dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the somber atmosphere of their first wedding. The vineyard was a hive of activity, with workers and volunteers bustling about, setting up for the celebration. Emily stood in front of the mirror in the guest house, smoothing down her simple white dress. Unlike the elaborate gown she'd worn for her first wedding, this dress was light and airy, more suited to the casual, intimate ceremony they had planned. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called. Sophia, her best friend and maid of honor, entered, her eyes widening as she took in Emily's appearance. "Oh, Em," she breathed, "you look beautiful." Emily smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "Thanks, Soph. Like this is exactly where I'm supposed to be." Sophia crossed the room and took Emily's hands in hers. "I have to admit, when you first told me about this whole arranged marriage thing, I thought your dad had finally lost it. But seeing you now, I've never seen you so happy." Emily laughed softly. "Believe me, I'm as surprised as anyone. If you told me a year ago that I'd be willingly renewing my vows to the humble gardener my father forced me to marry, I'd have said you were crazy." "Life has a funny way of surprising us," Sophia said, giving Emily's hands a squeeze. "Now, are you ready to go get remarried to that handsome husband of yours?" With a deep breath and a nod, Emily followed Sophia out of the guest house and towards the clearing where the ceremony would take place. Meanwhile, Jake stood under an arch of grapevines and wildflowers, nervously adjusting his tie. He wore a simple suit, forgoing the formal tuxedo of their first wedding for something more comfortable and true to who he was. Richard Collins approached, looking more relaxed and approachable than Jake had ever seen him. "Nervous?" he asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. Jake chuckled, a little, which is silly, considering we're already married. Richard nodded, his expression turning serious. "Jake, I owe you an apology. When I forced you and Emily into this marriage, I thought I was teaching her a lesson. So I never expected any of this." Jake was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Mr. Collins, Richard, I won't pretend that what you did was right, but I can't bring myself to regret it either." Your decision brought Emily into my life, and for that, I'll always be grateful." Richard's eyes misted slightly. "You're a good man, Jake. I'm proud to call you my son-in-law, and I'm even prouder of the woman my daughter has become, thanks in no small part to you." Before Jake could respond, the soft strains of music began to play, signaling the start of the ceremony. All eyes turned to the path leading from the guest house, and Jake felt his breath catch in his throat as Emily came into view. She walked alone this time, no longer a reluctant bride being given away, but a woman making her own choice. Her eyes locked with Jake's, and the love and joy radiating from her was palpable. As Emily reached Jake, she took both his hands in hers, her smile so bright it rivaled the sun. The officiant, a local judge who had become a friend during their fight to save the valley, began the ceremony. "Friends, family, and members of our community," she began, "we are gathered here today, not to join Emily and Jake in marriage, for they have already taken that step, but to celebrate their choice to recommit to each other, this time fully and freely." Emily and Jake had written their own vows this time, and as they spoke, there wasn't a dry eye in the gathering. Jake went first, his voice steady and full of emotion. "Emily, when we first met, I thought you were the most beautiful, infuriating woman I'd ever encountered. You challenged me, pushed me, and ultimately, you saved me. You saw past the simple gardener to the man underneath, and you loved both parts of me. I promise to spend the rest of our lives showing you how much that means to me, how much you mean to me. I love you, Emily Collins Thornton, with everything I am." Emily blinked back tears as she began her vows. "Jake, you came into my life like a whirlwind, upending everything I thought I knew about myself and the world. It taught me the value of hard work, the beauty of simplicity, and the power of true partnership. And you've stood by me through every challenge, believing in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I promise to love you, support you, and continue growing with you for all the days of our lives. You are my heart, my home, and my happily ever after." As they exchanged rings, simple bands engraved with grape fins, a symbol of their shared love for the vineyard, the officiant pronounced them husband and hubert for the first time. Their kiss was met with cheers and applause from their gathered friends and family. As they turned to face the crowd, Emily caught sight of her father. Richard Collins stood tall, pride and love evident in his eyes. For the first time in years, Emily felt truly reconciled with her father, grateful for the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The reception that followed was a joyous affair, full of laughter, good food, and of course, excellent wine. As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the vineyard, Emily and Jake snuck away for a moment alone. They stood at the edge of the vineyard, arms wrapped around each other, looking out over the land that had brought them together. "So, Mrs. Collins Thornton," Jake said, pressing a kiss to Emily's temple, "are you ready for our next adventure?" Emily laughed, the sound full of joy and promise. "With you, always. Bring on the grape stomping, the early harvests, the fight against corporate takeovers. As long as we're together, I'm ready for anything." As they shared another kiss, the sound of their friends and family celebrating drifting over from the reception, Emily and Jake knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. Their love, born from an arranged marriage and tempered by adversity, had grown into something beautiful and unbreakable. The vineyard stretched out before them, a testament to their shared passion and hard work. And as the first stars began to twinkle in the twilight sky, Emily and Jake looked to the future with hope, love, and the unshakable bond of true partnership. As the weeks turned into months following their vow renewal, Emily and Jake found themselves busier than ever. The fight to save the valley had intensified, with Riverdale Development pulling out all the stops to push through their resort plans. But the couple, along with the entire community, stood firm in their resolve. One crisp autumn morning, Emily stood on the porch of the guest house, now their permanent home by choice, cradling a mug of steaming coffee. The vineyard stretched out before her, the vines heavy with ripe grapes ready for harvest. Jake appeared beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Big day today," he said, pressing a kiss to her temple. Emily nodded, a mix of excitement and nervousness fluttering in her stomach. The final town hall meeting. Even after this, the council votes on Riverdale's proposal. They had spent months rallying support, presenting alternative development plans that would preserve the valley's agricultural heritage while still boosting the local economy. Today was the culmination of all their hard work. As they drove to the town hall, Emily couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed. The woman who had once lived for parties and shopping now found her greatest joy in the rhythm of vineyard life and the fight to preserve it. The town hall was packed, with supporters on both sides filling every available seat. Emily and Jake took their places at the front, ready to make their final appeal. As Emily stood to speak, she caught sight of her father in the crowd. Richard Collins nodded encouragingly, a far cry from the controlling patriarch she'd once been. Emily took a deep breath and began. Friends, neighbors, members of the council, we stand at a crossroads today. The choice before us isn't just about land use or economic development, it's about who we are as a community and what we value. As she spoke passionately about the importance of preserving their agricultural heritage, the jobs that would be protected, and the sustainable tourism model they'd developed, Emily could see the impact her words were having, and even some of Riverdale's supporters looked thoughtful. Jake followed with a detailed presentation of their financial projections, showing how their plan could bring prosperity to the valley without sacrificing its soul. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. The Riverdale representatives made their case next, touting job creation numbers and promising a boost to the local economy, but their arguments felt hollow in the face of the community spirit Emily and Jake had fostered. As the council prepared to vote, Alex approached Emily and Jake. His face was resigned but not unkind. "You've put up one hell of a fight," he said. "Whatever happens, well, you should be proud." Emily felt a wave of compassion for her former flame. "Thank you, Alex. I hope you can understand why this means so much to us." Alex nodded. "I'm beginning to. Good luck." The room fell silent as the council members cast their votes. Emily gripped Jake's hand tightly, her heart pounding. And then, the motion to reject Riverdale Development's proposal passes, the council chairman announced. The valley will remain zoned for agricultural use. The room exploded in cheers. Emily found herself swept into Jake's arms, laughing and crying at the same time. They had done it. They had saved the valley. In the weeks that followed, Emily and Jake threw themselves into implementing their plans for the valley. The co-op they had envisioned became a reality, with local vineyards working together to strengthen their position in the market. Emily's marketing expertise came into play as they rebranded the valley, attracting a new wave of eco-conscious tourists eager to experience authentic vineyard life. One evening, about a year after their victory at the town hall, Emily and Jake sat on their porch, watching the sun set over their thriving vineyard. A half-empty bottle of their award-winning Cabernet sat between them, the first vintage they'd produced together. "I have some news," Emily said, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Jake raised an eyebrow. "Oh, good news, I hope." Emily took his hand, placing it gently on her stomach. "The best kind. We're going to have a baby." Jake's eyes widened in shock before his face split into a joyous grin. He pulled Emily into a tight embrace, peppering her face with kisses. "A baby," he whispered in awe. "We're going to be parents." As they sat there, planning for their future and dreaming of the child they would raise surrounded by grapevines and love, Emily marveled at the journey that had brought them to this point. "You know," she said softly, "if someone had told me 2 years ago that I'd be living in a guest house, running a vineyard, married to the gardener, and happier than I've ever been, I'd have thought they were crazy." Jake chuckled, pulling her closer. "Life has a funny way of giving us exactly what we need, even when we don't know we need it." Emily nodded, thinking of her father's misguided attempt to teach her a lesson. "I suppose I should thank Dad for his crazy arranged marriage scheme. Without it, I might never have found all of this." "Speaking of your dad," Jake said, "how do you think he'll react to becoming a grandfather?" Emily laughed. "I think he'll be over the moon. He's come a long way too, you know. I saw him helping Mrs. Rodriguez prune her vines the other day. Voluntarily." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Emily felt a profound sense of peace wash over her. This was where she belonged, who she was meant to be. "I love you," she said, turning to Jake. "Thank you for showing me what really matters in life." Jake kissed her softly. "I love you too. Thank you for making me a better man." As night fell over the vineyard, Emily and Jake remained on the porch, talking quietly about their hopes and dreams for their growing family. The challenges they had faced, and those yet to come, had only strengthened their bond. They were partners in every sense of the word, ready to take on whatever life might bring. From reluctant bride to passionate advocate, from spoiled heiress to dedicated vintner, Emily's journey had been one of transformation and self-discovery, and as she sat there, wrapped in the arms of the man she loved, with a new life growing inside her, she knew that the best was yet to come. The vineyard stretched out before them, a testament to their love, their hard work, and the power of following one's heart. As the cool night air carried the sweet scent of ripening grapes, Emily and Jake looked to the future with hope, love, and the unshakable bond of true partnership. Their story, like a fine wine, had only grown richer and more complex with time, and the best vintages they both knew were still to come. Life's greatest gifts often come disguised as our biggest challenges. Emily and Jake's journey teach us that true love and personal growth can blossom in the most unexpected places. Their story reminds us that our preconceptions about happiness and success can blind us to the beauty of a simpler, more authentic life. Just as Emily learned to appreciate the richness of vineyard life, we too can find fulfillment by embracing change and opening our hearts to new experiences. Their struggle to save the valley shows us the power of community and the importance of fighting for what truly matters. Remember, like a fine wine, relationships deepen and improve with time, patience, and care. Every challenge you face together can strengthen your bond, every misunderstanding can lead to greater understanding, and every shared triumph can sweeten your connection. In the end, true wealth isn't measured by money or status, but by the love we share, the lives we touch, and the legacy we leave behind. So dare to let life surprise you. Embrace the unexpected turns in your journey, for they may lead you to your truest self and your greatest happiness. Your happily ever after might not look like what you imagined, but it could be more beautiful than you ever dreamed. Trust in love, believe in yourself, and never underestimate the transformative power of following your heart. We hope Emily and Jake's story touched your heart, and perhaps even inspired you to see life's challenges in a new light. Now, we'd love to hear from you. What part of their journey resonated with you the most? Have you ever experienced an unexpected turn in life that led to something beautiful? Or perhaps you're facing a challenge right now and found hope in this tale? Share your thoughts, experiences, or any questions you might have in the comments below. Your story could be the inspiration someone else needs today. And if you enjoyed this video and want more engaging stories that blend romance, personal growth, and life lessons, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. That way you'll never miss out on our latest uploads. Remember, every like, comment, and subscription helps our channel grow and allows us to keep bringing you content that touches the heart and stirs the soul. Thank you for watching, and we can't wait to read your comments. Until next time, may your own life story be as rich and fulfilling as a well-aged wine.